Good evening, everybody. So tonight's class is continuing with our series that we discussed. But before we get into the topic at hand, we're going to just veer off topic slightly while remaining on theme and brand in general. Because today is the 10th of Shvat and tonight is the 11th of Shvat, which together are two very important, auspicious days on the Chabad calendar. So to put a little bit of historical context in place, the Chabad dynasty of rabbis extended from the Alter Rebbe, who was the first Chabad Rebbe, the one who authored the Tanya and introduced Chabad Hasidus, and went from generation to generation. After he was the Rebbe, then came his son, and then his grandson, etc., until the time period of, during the Holocaust was when the sixth Chabad Rebbe, who miraculously made it to America during the war, brought the Chabad movement to New York. And as he was known in the Chabad circles as the Frierdiker Rebbe, or in English, the previous Rebbe, his goal when he arrived in New York, when he arrived in America, which brought the Chabad movement from Europe, from Russia, Ukraine, to American soil, what he was most famous for saying was, America is nicht anders, which in Yiddish, these words translate to mean, America is no different. And he was referencing the fact that many of the Jewish people who had come from, the shtetl in Europe and had lived very pious religious lifestyles while they were back in Europe, came to America and, threw their kippahs off the ship as they landed, and they departed from their ships on American soil. And they felt that, America is the new country. We have to behave differently. We cannot have our antiquated laws and our antiquated rituals. And we have to live as modern people. And when the Frierdiker Rebbe came to America, his idea was that America is no different. The same way that we kept the Torah in the, the olden days, we have to bring that into the modern era as well. And he began this movement of starting programs and sending people to start organizations and really bringing Jewish life to a vibrant place here in America. And his passing on the 10th of Shvat, which was today, in New York, was a huge blow to the Chabad community. And the one who was looked upon to be the successor, the next Rebbe, was his son-in-law, but he refused to take upon himself the mantle of leadership. And it was a year of a lot of persuading and a lot of asking, and really it was actually the Rebbe's wife who really pushed the Rebbe to take upon himself the mantle of leadership. And it was at the Farbrengen, the Hasidic gathering, on the 10th of Shvat, in honor of the first yahrzeit, the anniversary of the passing of the Frierdiker Rebbe, that the one who is now known as the Rebbe, the seventh Rebbe, recited a mimer. Now, a mimer is a Hasidic discourse, which talks about very lofty ideas, Hasidic thoughts, and an original mimer is only said by a Rebbe. A discourse is basically a speech, but it's a very deep discussionary speech. And this was something that the Rebbe had obviously never said because he wasn't assuming the mantle of leadership. And at that Farbrengen on Yud Shvat, on the 10th of Shvat, the Rebbe recited for the first time a mimer, which was basically announcing the acceptance of the leadership as Rebbe, as the leader of the Chabad movement and the leader of the Jewish world. And so this day, the 10th day of the month of Shvat, is such an important day, not just for the Chabad community, but for the entire world Jewry. Because when the Rebbe became the leader, his mission was not to create followers. The Rebbe's mission was to create leaders. And the Rebbe sent emissaries to every corner of the world to open Chabad centers. And even within communities that already had Jewish infrastructure, the Rebbe empowered every single individual to be a leader in their world. You know, the Rebbe taught that you don't have to know everything in order to teach something. The Rebbe said, if you know Aleph, teach Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. If you know a little bit, you teach a little bit. You learn Bet, you'll teach Bet. And the idea is that wherever we are, we can create an environment that brings spirituality into this world. And we do that by being an example, by letting our soul shine, and by sharing and inspiring everyone around us with whatever knowledge of Torah and godliness that we have. And in the Rebbe's first mimer, which is the theme of Yud Shvat, which is the theme of the Rebbe's entire leadership, actually is the very famous mimer which starts with the words Basi Lagani. And Basi Lagani talks about how God has this beautiful garden, and the world is God's garden. And through generations of sinning and separation from godliness, God's presence left the garden. And our goal is to bring God's presence back into the garden. And ultimately, when Mashiach comes and the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt, that's when God's presence will fully return to the garden. And our goal is to do, one little mitzvah, one step at a time, to bring God's presence into the garden and create a spiritual oasis in the physical world. Because when God created the world, it was a physical world that emanated spirituality. And our mission in this world is to restore the world back to the natural state in which God created it. And this idea actually really leads us into the topic that we're discussing tonight, because the example of the world in its perfect state, the global experience that we will have when the world is fully immersed in spirituality, has a tiny microcosm that we experience every week. Every week, we enter a state that's like a mini version of the times of the redemption. And that is Shabbat. In fact, the time when the Beit HaMikdash will be rebuilt and we'll have the Geula, in the times of the redemption, it's called Yom Shekulo Shabbat, the day that it will always be Shabbat. Because Shabbat is the spiritual island in time. It's this holy oasis in the middle of a very physical, materialistic work week, where we enter into a very different dimension, and our homes specifically become a place where spirituality takes over physicality in such a profound way. And so we see something very powerful when it comes to Shabbat. But before we get to the idea of Shabbat, we're going to focus on which room in our house we're elevating. Because really, Shabbat encompasses every room in the house. But if we had to focus one area of the house where we really feel Shabbat, it's the dining room. It's the dining room. Or whether it's the kitchen table that becomes the dining room. The Shabbat table is the space where we feel the most Shabbat. And in fact, in preparing for Shabbat, of course, a lot of the preparation for Shabbat takes place in the kitchen. But when we prepare our home to feel, there's a word that we use that's Shabbostic. Shabbostic means that we have the feeling of Shabbat. We have the feeling of that spiritual energy that encompasses the time period from Friday evening after sundown until, Saturday once it's dark. That 25-hour period, there's just a different feeling. And in fact, one of the biggest preparations that we have to prepare ourselves for this beautiful weekend experience is preparing our table. In fact, the custom is that we should have a tablecloth. Specifically, there are many who have the custom to use a white tablecloth on our table. And in fact, it is said that the tablecloth should remain on the table for the entire duration of Shabbat. Growing up, my mother would make sure that there was not a table in the house that didn't have a tablecloth on Shabbat. Every table in our house always had a tablecloth on Shabbat. And God forbid you should take off the tablecloth on Shabbat. I mean, if the tablecloth was dirty, it was like slide one tablecloth before you put on the other. The table was never, ever bare on Shabbat. And growing up, that was always very significant to me, that a table on Shabbat is dressed for Shabbat. It's like, just like we wear special clothing for Shabbat, the table is dressed for Shabbat. And one of the most important things that we have on our Shabbat table, or for those who put it on the side, if you don't want to have it exactly on the table, although there is a custom to have it directly on the table, are the Shabbat candles. And we usher in the Shabbat, what welcomes Shabbat into our homes. On the dining room table, yes. Many people have that custom, or if it's near the dining room table, but it should definitely be in the room where you eat. You should be able to see it from the table. Yes, it's best to have it on the dining room table. That's a great question. We'll get to that if it makes the table muksa. We'll discuss that after. It should be on the dining room table or in a place where when you're eating the Shabbat dinner, you should be able to see the Shabbat candles. In fact, when the person makes Kiddush, whoever's making Kiddush, they have to be able to see the candles when they're making Kiddush. So on the table, near the table, it's part of the dining room experience. Who is the one who lights the candles that bring Shabbat into the home? It's the woman. The woman is the one who brings Shabbat into the home. In fact, lighting Shabbat candles is one of the 3 mitzvot specifically entrusted to women. And it is one of the times when the gates of heaven open specifically for women. And when we light the Shabbat candles, we bring into our home that sense of calm, that sense of peace, the sense of spirituality and tranquility that comes together with Shabbat. Now, I'm sure it's not just in my house, but Erev Shabbat, the Friday afternoon energy, can be a little frenzy, right? I mean, it's hectic. There's a lot to prepare. You know that once you light the candles, there are a lot of things that you cannot do anymore. So it's hectic. And as much as you try to plan in advance, there's always something to do last minute. I mean, it's just the way it is.
And there's always something that has to happen.
Always. Of course. It's this frenetic energy. And the truth is, I always used to look at it like a negative thing. Like I was always trying to avoid that. And I've come to embrace it, and I'll tell you why. There is this energy that becomes electric, like the same way when you're preparing for something that's very exciting. It's just a feeling that captures you. And you can either get stressed out by it, which many of us do, and that's totally normal, or we can choose to be like, yes, this is the time to be in hectic mode. But as soon as we light the candles, there's a switch that turns. And something just changes. Now, first of all, I always think to myself, This is the most relaxing time because as soon as I light the candles, there is nothing that I can do right now that I cannot do in 10 minutes from now. So I may as well just relax now. Like nothing can change right now once I light the Shabbat candles for another 10 minutes. There's nothing that has to happen this minute other than relaxing and taking in the Shabbat calm and peace. But in the actual moment when we're lighting the candles, we are actually welcoming Shabbat into our home. And Shabbat is called Shabbat HaMalka, the Shabbat Queen. And we usher her into our home like a queen, because there is a feminine energy associated with Shabbat. There is an energy of beauty, of femininity, a queenly energy that becomes present in our home during this time, which is why the queen of the home and the little princesses welcome the Shabbat into the home. Now, there are two aspects of keeping Shabbat. When God gave the commandment of keeping Shabbat, there were two words that were said. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat and Shamar et Yom HaShabbat. Zachor means to remember. Shamar means to keep or safeguard. And our sages tell us that when God said those words, you could bring him to the party. Shamar and Zachor were actually uttered at exactly the same moment. Now, this is something that's humanly impossible. It's not possible for a human to say two different words at the exact same time, no matter what technology they come up with, right? We cannot say two different things at the exact same moment, but God has godly powers. And when God said those words, they were said simultaneously. Now, Zachor, to remember Shabbat, refers to all of the things that we do to honor Shabbat. Shamar, safeguarding Shabbat, refers to all of the things we do not do in order not to transgress the laws of Shabbat. So it's more of a positive and a negative connotation. And God said each one simultaneously to remind us that although there are a lot of things that we cannot do on Shabbat, there is so much that we can do and we should do on Shabbat. And it's so important to focus on both equally. It's not enough to just say, well, let me do beautiful things on Shabbat to keep my home, feeling culturally Shabbat, but also do other things that are forbidden on Shabbat. And it's also not good to get so caught up in all the things that you cannot do on Shabbat that it becomes something that's so restrictive. Because if you look at the laws of keeping Shabbat, it could seem like a very, very difficult day of things that you're just not allowed to do, things that you have to stop yourself from doing, things that you have to restrain yourself from doing, all the things you cannot do. It could become a very challenging day. So God is telling us that when we approach Shabbat, we have to approach both together. And they all have a shared goal. Both the things that we do to celebrate Shabbat and the things that we are not allowed to do on Shabbat are all for the same goal of creating this atmosphere of peace and holiness in our lives and in our homes. And that is why Shabbat candles are lit in a pair of two. We have one candle for Shamar, one candle for Zachor. Now, according to halacha, the woman is the one who lights the candles. If there is no woman in the house, then a man should light the candles because every home should have Shabbat candles lit in it. But the mitzvah is specifically given to women. Married women light 2 candles, single women light 1. Many mothers have the tradition to add an additional candle for each of their children. And it is customary that as soon as a child, a girl, is old enough to be able to recite a blessing, which is usually around 3 years old, she can light her own candle as well. And this was something that the Rebbe very, very strongly encouraged, that young girls should light Shabbat candles as well. There are many different customs. But specifically, this is something that the Rebbe encouraged all girls and women to do, Ashkenaz, Sephardic, in every community, to light candles. Yes?
So you say, and then I'll say after.
So the way it's done actually is that the child should light before the mother, so that the mother can assist the child in lighting her own candle, because once you've lit candles, you can't light anymore because it's Shabbat for you. So I can share with you what I do in my house. Thank God we have many candlesticks in my house. I light 6 candles, 2 big ones and then 4 little ones for each of my kids. And my 4-year-old daughter lights her own candle as well. In addition to that, she lights her own candle, and Mashi will be lighting pretty soon, because she stands there going like this and mumbling along. She's learning the blessing. By the time she turns 2.5, Bezrat Hashem, she'll be lighting as well. And so the mother lights with the children first. They say the blessing, and then the mother lights her own candles, or you can help your daughter light the candles. Then you light the candles and say the blessing all together. As long as you're available to, help your daughter light the candle. You have a question? Yes. That's a great question. So that's where we're going to get to now. You're asking specifically why women, or why do candles have to be lit? Okay, so that's where we're getting to now. So why is this specifically? Yes.
You said once you light the candles, you cannot light anymore. So, but sometimes it takes me more than 1 minute to have 8 candles.
Okay, that's a great question as well. And we're gonna get to that specific. So once we get to the steps, I'll explain that. So let's first discuss why it is the woman who does it, and then we'll discuss the practical, step by step how to. So why women? So we've discussed this specifically in our first class in this series, but in general, this is a topic that we've discussed plenty of times. How the woman is the foundation of the home. And the woman is the one who sets the tone for the energy and the environment in the home. And because the woman is the one who has that foundational ability to create an energy in the home, she is the one who ushers in the energy of Shabbat into the home with the mitzvah of lighting the candles. Now, the candles are lit for several reasons. First of all, it's the concept of bringing light into the world. The world is a dark place. There's so much darkness in the world. And our responsibility as human beings, as Jews, and definitely as Jewish women, is to bring light into the world. And we do that in so many different ways. We do that with every mitzvah that we do. We do that with every kind day. We do that with every positive interaction. But physically, when do we bring physical light into the world? We do that when we light Shabbat candles. And because this is the role of the woman in her home in general, when Shabbat comes, that mitzvah is specifically given to the women to show the physical act of what we're always doing all week. So really, it's a representation of what we're always doing, which is bringing light and joy and happiness into our homes, into our lives, into the lives of our loved ones. As well, the candles symbolize peace. Now, thank God nowadays, we don't rely on candles as our only source of light. We have plenty of light, we have electricity, we have all the things that we need in order to make sure that our home could be bright. Even on Shabbat, we can set timers if we wanted to go off and then turn on Shabbat. We have the ability to have homes that are lit up on Shabbat. But in ancient times, that wasn't possible. As soon as it was nighttime, it was dark. So in order to make sure that Shabbat was a pleasant evening and that the Shabbat dinner was a pleasant experience, there had to be light. And the light is what brings about peace. When you can see someone, you can have a much more peaceful conversation than when you're stumbling in the dark all over each other. And the woman has a very key role in maintaining peace in her home. And because the candles symbolize peace, the woman is the one who lights the candles, which represents peace in the home. Also, the flame is the representation of the soul. Our neshama is referred to as a flame. And in Jewish tradition, the soul, the Jewish soul of every child comes from the mother. A Jewish mother bears Jewish children. Souls are passed down through the maternal line. And the woman lighting the candles, which represents the soul, also demonstrates and represents this idea that the woman is the one who kindles the soul of her Jewish children. So we have all of these beautiful reasons, and there are many more, why the woman is the one specifically who lights the candles. And we know that the candles, which represent both the physical light and the spiritual light, are actually physical candles. But you know what? Fire, flames, are such a cross between physicality and spirituality. I mean, scientifically, a fire is a physical thing. But when you look at fire, it has such a non-physical feeling to it. You know, it's so ethereal. It's so not tangible. Fire itself, what the fire looks like, the way the fire behaves, is something that's so different than any other physical matter. There's no weight or volume. You can't really measure it or define what it's made out of. It's constantly in movement. And the nature of a flame is very similar to the nature of the soul. The nature of a flame is that once it's lit, it doesn't stop moving. I mean, if you look at a flame, of course, there are times when a flame is still, but it's in constant movement. And if you look at a flame, it's always moving upwards. Now, I remember the first time I held a match by myself. I was lighting Shabbat candles, and I used to, when I was younger, I was always, you know, I don't know who was more afraid. If it was, I was afraid of holding the match, or my mother was afraid of me holding the match. Either way, my mother would hold the match, and I would hold my mother's hand with her. And I remember the first time I was holding a match by myself. I don't remember how old I was, but I was obviously old enough that my mother trusted me to do that. I remember my mother telling me, never hold a match upside down. Now, why do you never hold a match upside down? Because the flame is going to burn you. Now, why is the flame going to burn you? If you hold it upside down, the flame should go down. But that's not the way it is, because a fire always goes upwards. You hold the candle like this, the flame goes up. You hold the candle like this, the flame goes up. Hold the candle like this, the flame is still trying to go up. Now, scientifically, I learned that the reason for that is because fire, the source of fire is the sun, and it's always trying to find its source. Very interesting. Don't quote me on the science of that, please. But that's what I was taught. But the idea is that it's always searching for its source. It's always searching to go upward. And our soul is the same way. Our soul is always trying to find elevation and growth and connection. Now, what stops the flame from just flying upward, because it's gravity defying? So what stops the flame from flying upward? Well, the candle, the wick. It's connected to something physical that holds it down, but it's always trying to go upwards. And our soul is the same way. Our soul is like the flame, and the candle is like our body. And the soul is within our body, but it's always trying to go up a level. And what ends up happening is that the flame is what turns the lump of wax and the cotton wick into a candle. Without it, it's just a lump of wax. In fact, the Israeli ambassador, Yehuda Avner, was once quoted describing a conversation that he had with a Rebbe. And in his conversation that he had with the Rebbe, he asked the Rebbe what his job is. And the Rebbe told him that my job is to take lumps of candles, lumps of wax, and turn them into candles by giving them a flame. Each one of us, we are a lump of wax, and what makes us into a candle, what makes us into a growing person? Our soul. And at the end of the conversation, he turns to the Rebbe and he says, so Rebbe, did you light my candle? And the Rebbe said, no, I gave you the match. Only you can light your own candle. But I gave you the match. Now, when we hold the match and we light the candles before Shabbat, we really have the ability to light the candles in our own soul, to strike that match and bring ourselves to a higher existence, to become more than just physical beings and become spiritually connected. And we do the same thing for our entire home. When you walk into a home, you should feel that it's Shabbos. When you walk into a home, you should feel that Shabbat energy. And we do that in both ways, with the Shamar and the Zachar, both with the things that we do on Shabbat. And by that, I mean by lighting the candles and reciting Kiddush and having a festive Shabbat dinner, by saying the special Shabbat prayers, whether it's in the synagogue or at home, by creating the atmosphere of Shabbat, singing Shabbat songs, dressing in special clothing for Shabbat, and also by not doing certain things, by refraining from work and by not using electricity and by not doing all of the things that are forbidden on Shabbat, together working hand in hand, that creates the feeling of this is a home where Shabbat is felt. This is a family that is celebrating Shabbat, that is feeling the warmth and the energy of Shabbat. Now, it's very important for us to know that Shabbat is not just a once a week thing. I mean, it comes once a week, but it's not just a once a week thing. Every day of the week, when we are going about our regular work week, we have the ability to elevate that entire work week by celebrating Shabbat. What do I mean by that? Well, there are many times that Shabbat is discussed in the Torah. The Torah talks about Shabbat many times. And one of the phrases that are discussed in relation to working on Shabbat is where on not working on Shabbat is where it says that for 6 days you should work, and on the 7th day you should rest. Or rather, in the 6 days work should be done, and on the 7th day you should not work. Now, it's interesting that in the times where the Torah talks about not working on Shabbat, it also mentions that you should work for 6 days. I mean, it could have just said on the 7th day, Shabbat, don't work. Yes. That's a great question. Mandatory before candle lighting. There are some people that take upon themselves extra customary stringencies that by midday, but that's extra customary. Mandatory before candle lighting, work should be stopped. But it's not considered, I was going to say illegal. It's not considered forbidden. Yeah, illegal, in the laws of halakha. But it's not really in the spirit of preparation for Shabbat. So, use your judgment and your custom. But it's very hard. No, 100%. 100%. And if it's also important to be able to turn our minds off and not focus on work during Shabbat. So if that's what's needed for you to be able to really not stress out about work on Shabbat, then take that into consideration as well. But getting back to this phrase in the Torah, why does the Torah have to tell us that we should work for 6 days? Like, we know we need to work for 6 days. But what the Torah is telling us, that by not working on Shabbat, by keeping Shabbat as a holy day, the rest of our work week becomes a mitzvah also. That the 6 days when we're involved in the physical world, they become holy by us keeping Shabbat. So in fact, Shabbat doesn't just elevate the 25 hours of Friday night and Saturday. It actually elevates the entire week retroactively. By us maintaining the spirituality of Shabbat, we uplift the physicality of the entire work week to also be a holy time. So when we turn off that physical work-oriented side of us, and we focus on our souls, our families, our communities, our friends, at that moment where we light Shabbat candles and until Shabbat ends, we've actually just illuminated the entire week behind us as well. Now, during the work week, no matter what you do, whether you have a job or not, or whatever you do, we're very much divided. There's, the different roles that we play. There's I can, speak for myself, but there's the mommy me, there's the wife me, there's the teacher me, there's the every, part of me. If you're a student and there's, your homework time, and then there's your work time, or, there's a lot of dividing. Or even if you don't have a specific role or a job, there's always, there's a lot of conflicting things to do during the week. You have this responsibility and that responsibility. You got to drive here and you got to do this and you got to go there. And there's so much. When Shabbat comes, we focus. It's all about whatever is important to us. It's the Shabbat me. We're with family, we're with friends, we're with community, we're by ourselves, whatever it is. But there's that focused, connected feeling. And that starts from when we light the Shabbat candles. Now, getting back to the steps of lighting the Shabbat candles, which it's important for us to know these steps, but it's also important for us to know the meaning behind it. Before we light our Shabbat candles, now getting to your question about whether the table becomes muktzah, the candles themselves, one of the things that we are forbidden to do on Shabbat from when the time of sundown begins is we are forbidden to light any fire, which is why we don't use any electricity. And, we set our timers, you set your oven in advance, take care of everything beforehand. But there is something that's called muktzah, which means that anything that's forbidden to use on Shabbat is also forbidden to touch on Shabbat. So the candles themselves, we don't touch on Shabbat. And if you only have candles on the table, yes, the table becomes muktzah as well, which is why you should have something else on the table as well. Either challah already on the table, something for Shabbat, your kiddush cup, your wine, or you can put a siddur or any other holy book on the table. And then the table is not just a vessel for the candles. So if that answers your question, so before you light the Shabbat candles, you make sure that there's something else on that table so that the table doesn't become, forbidden to touch or move on Shabbat. And then we strike the match. Now, usually a blessing is said before a mitzvah is done. There are many blessings that we say before we do mitzvahs. Before you eat something, the blessing is said before we eat. When you shake the lulav, you make the blessing and then you do it. Every mitzvah that has a blessing, the blessing is said before the mitzvah is done. The difference is when it comes to lighting Shabbat candles. First, we light the candles and then we say the blessing. So when we say the blessing, that is when we accept Shabbat upon ourselves. So as many times as you need to strike a match or light the candles, you can, because you haven't said the blessing yet, which is why, like we spoke about, helping a child, you help the child before you make your own blessing so that it is not, you haven't yet accepted Shabbat upon yourself. Now, customarily, the Shabbat candle lighting time is 18 minutes before sunset, which is the time when we light Shabbat candles. After those 18 minutes, it's forbidden to light Shabbat candles. In fact, as heartbreaking as it is, if somebody misses that time, it's better not to light candles than to light after that time, because lighting candles is actually forbidden during that time. So we light the Shabbat candles, and there are many, many Jewish calendars that have the exact time for exactly what time to light Shabbat. You can also find it online. You have a question?
Yeah, like let's say Shabbat candle lighting is 30. I heard that you have 18 minutes after that you can still light.
Yes, exactly. Because the candle lighting time that we usually have is 18 minutes before sunset. After sunset, it's forbidden to light candles. So it gives you a little bit of leeway, but customarily we try to light on time, not rely on those 18 minutes. Those are emergency minutes. So if you haven't lit yet, it's an emergency.
Okay.
Does that answer the question? All right. Meaning plan a little in advance. So the idea is that when you strike the match, you light the candles, and then once you finish lighting your candles, in fact, you should not blow out the match or wave out the match, because you're also forbidden to extinguish fire on Shabbat. So for anyone who's lit candles in my house, I always have like a little tray or a piece of silver foil or something so I can put it down, or I give it to my husband to blow it out for me.
Well, after I light, I put the match under the sink, just in case I don't want it to.
There you go. That's a good option, as long as you're not actually, blowing it out or waving it out. And then
Oh, no, you can't blow it out?
you shouldn't blow out the match, because once you finish lighting the candles, you've begun accepting Shabbat upon yourself. So you can put the match down on a metal sheet and it just will go out on its own. Matches do that, by the way.
What about, because you said until we recite, we have more day, can't we light, blow it out?
You could, but it's better not to, because once you finish lighting, you already started that stage. And then before we say the blessing, we wave our hands 3 times in front of the candles, and we cover our eyes. Now, why do we wave our hands 3 times? So we're welcoming Shabbat. It's this act of physically bringing in welcoming Shabbat. And we do this 3 times because in our souls, we have 3 dimensions. There's the level of speech. There's the level of thought. Well, really, thought comes first. There's the level of thought. Then there's the level of speech, and there's the level of action. And we want to bring the beauty of Shabbat and the feeling of spirituality of Shabbat into our thoughts, into our speech, and into our actions. And that's what we welcome Shabbat into our homes and into ourselves. That our thoughts should be filled with the peaceful spiritual nature of Shabbat, that our words should be filled with that energy, and our actions should reflect the beauty of Shabbat. And after we have welcomed them in, we cover our eyes and we say the blessing. Now, why do we cover our eyes? First of all, we cover our eyes because, like we said, it's flipped. Usually, you do the blessing first and then you do the action. But we cannot do it in that order, because once you've done the blessing, it's forbidden to light candles. So we cover our eyes so that we should only enjoy the candles after we've said the blessing, so that the blessing should come before the mitzvah of enjoying the candles. Because the goal is to look at the Shabbat candles and feel the energy of Shabbat in our homes. So we cover our eyes so we can say the blessing, and then when we uncover them, we can experience the mitzvah of enjoying the candles. As well, by covering our eyes, we're creating this personal space that's just us and God. We're creating a space where we block out the rest of the world and we just feel the gates of heaven open before us. Now, it's something so magnificent that each one of us, every single Friday, gets a private audience with Hashem. If you imagine the creator of the world, the one who created everything in the world, It's a busy Friday afternoon, Friday evening, and God says, let's have a private chat. I'm here to listen to every single one of your prayers. And we say the blessing, and then we keep our eyes covered for as long as you choose. And this is a time where you can add any personal blessing, any personal prayer, whether you say the prayers or you just think the prayers. It's a time that's just between you and God. It is something that really is an opportunity that we could take upon ourselves, that we can use this opportunity to have a private conversation with God. Just like when a woman makes challah, the time right after she does the mitzvah of separating challah, and when a woman is in the mikvah. Those are the three mitzvot of women, and this is the time when God says, my daughter, I'm listening. Now, when you really want to connect with someone, and you want to know that someone really cares about you, one of the best ways that you know that someone really cares about you is that when you talk, they listen. Being a good listener is a really important part of being in a relationship. And this is the time in our relationship with God when God is listening, when God just hears what we have to say, when God is just there, his presence is felt, that we could just open up to him. And it's such a beautiful, powerful time. And that's what sets the tone for the rest of Shabbat. This energy of feeling that God is so close to us, that God is so present, that God's presence is actually in our homes. And that's what we feel during the entire duration of Shabbat. And every single thing that we do during the 25 hours of Shabbat takes on this different dimension. And that's something that we have ushered into our home. That's something that we have welcomed into our home. And getting back to the idea of our purpose and our mission in this world, which the Rebbe taught us, and that the Rebbe gave us this mandate specifically today and tomorrow when we're celebrating the acceptance of the Rebbe as our leader, is that the Rebbe told us our mission is to bring God's presence into this world. And on a cosmic level, that's what we're waiting for with the coming of the redemption. But a microcosm of that is every single week in our homes. Every single week when we bring Shabbat into our homes, we're bringing a little bit of that taste of the coming of Mashiach into our homes. And that extends itself through the entire Shabbat. So by having this beautiful Shabbat table with Shabbat candles in our dining room, we elevate the space and we make it a sacred and holy space that can be filled with such spirituality. And that's something that we can take into every week, every day of the week. In fact, there's a custom to do something every day to prepare for Shabbat. There was a great Jewish leader in the Talmudic time who it was said that everything he ate was always in honor of Shabbat. Every time he bought something, any food, he would say, oh, this is in honor of Shabbat. So if he would find a nice piece of meat, this is good for Shabbat. And then maybe that was on Monday. So on Tuesday, he found a nicer piece of meat. So he would say, okay, I'll eat the one from yesterday and this one I'll leave for Shabbat. So he was always constantly preparing for Shabbat. It's something that's so beautiful. But it doesn't have to be, you don't have to cook a whole week for Shabbat. It doesn't have to become a whole week long affair. But if we do something a little bit, think about it for Shabbat. I know for myself, every Monday I do laundry. So I end up washing all of the Shabbat clothes that got dirty on Shabbat. So I always think to myself, we're already preparing for Shabbat because we're already, washing the laundry for the upcoming week. But whatever it is, when we bring the spirit of Shabbat into our home, whether you're in the supermarket and you see a treat and you buy it, oh, this is, something delicious for Shabbat, or you have a good book and I'll save it to read it on Shabbat, or whatever it is. When we bring the preparation of Shabbat into our week, it gives us that excitement, that feeling, that energy of making our home that holy and sacred space. So we have this incredible opportunity, this incredible experience that we can use, and depending on how we choose to perceive it is how much we're going to feel it. Shabbat comes every week, whether you're there or not. Shabbat happens whether you're ready or not. And Shabbat is there in the air, whether you connect to it or not. It's like Wi-Fi. If you think about it, it's like Wi-Fi. You walk into a room, there's Wi-Fi in the room. But you're only going to appreciate it if you connect your device. Otherwise, it's just floating around in the air. The energy of Shabbat is there. But in order for us to connect to it, we need the proper devices. So lighting Shabbat candles is a device that connects us to Shabbat. We have to, and sometimes you need the right password, because if you don't have the right password, you can't connect to the Wi-Fi. So you need to have the right password. You need to be keeping Shabbat in the proper way, the way God tells us to keep Shabbat, so that we can really feel it. And the more we observe Shabbat in a way that aligns with Hashem's vision of Shabbat for the world, the more we feel the sense of peace and connection that Shabbat brings us. And that depends on us. Everyone is at their own level of Shabbat observance, whether it's just lighting Shabbat candles or keeping Shabbat in its entirety. Whatever we do, that's the impact that it has on our lives, and that's the impact that it has on creating the sacred space in our home. So today's Wednesday. It's basically Thursday already, right? So it's basically Erev Shabbat. So l'chaim to making our homes a holy space, a sacred space, and most importantly, a happy space, by bringing the joy of Shabbat into our lives, by bringing it into our homes, and that our table, a whole week, it should be the Shabbat table. You have a dining room table, you could call it the dining room table, you could call it the Shabbos table. I grew up, now that I think about it, it makes me laugh. But when I grew up, we had something that we used to call Shabbos soup. I never knew the concept of chicken soup. We called it Shabbos soup. My mother would only make chicken soup for Shabbos, and we called it Shabbos soup. Now, we might have been eating Shabbos soup on Sunday night or Monday night or Thursday, but it was always called Shabbos soup. The dining room table in my house growing up was always called the Shabbos table. We used it a whole week for other things, but this was the Shabbos table. Now, we had a table in the kitchen where we ate dinner a whole week, but this was the Shabbos table. Find something in your home that's connected. The candlesticks, they're Shabbos candlesticks. They're the Shabbat candles. These are Shabbat clothing. My daughter's dress shoes, they're called Shabbat shoes. Make this something that when you look at it, you connect to Shabbat. And most importantly, let's be Shabbat people. That I'm a Shabbat Ima, right? The Ima Shel Shabbat, that in school, the little girls are the Ima Shel Shabbat. A whole week we should be with that energy, with that presence. So l'chaim to being able to find that spirituality a whole week, and to be able to usher the spirituality into our homes once a week. And even before this Shabbat, we should be celebrating in Yerushalayim with Mashiach. So l'chaim to that. If anyone has any questions, please ask. Yes.
Like 2 candles, I'm single. Is it okay to light 2
It
candles?
is. That's a really great question. First of all, once you start lighting a certain amount of candles, you do not go back. So if you already light 2, and that's an established custom for you, you do not go down. But if you're the only one lighting candles in the home, then it's perfectly okay to be lighting 2, even if you're not married. That's perfectly fine. And a woman who was previously married and lit 2 candles, even if she's not married anymore, she still continues to light 2 candles, because we don't decrease light and holiness and spirituality. We only grow.
But you didn't say there was a light.
So yes, married women light 2, single women light 1, but many people who even if they're not married, if they want to have 2 candles lit in the home, then they light 2 candles in their home as well. But halachically, a woman only has to light 2 once she's married.
Why don't we